The Forgotten Soldier. The soft, rhythmic beeping of medical monitors filled the chemotherapy ward at St. John's Veterans Medical Center. The air carried the scent of antiseptic and something metallic, like old blood. It was the kind of smell that stuck to your clothes, clung to your skin, and nestled in the back of your throat. Jack Sullivan, a 56-year-old veteran with a gaunt face and sunken eyes, sat slumped in a hospital chair, his arms crossed over his chest. The worn leather recliner creaked as he shifted uncomfortably, the IV drip feeding a slow, steady stream of chemicals into his veins. The room was cold, even with the thick government-issued blanket draped over his lap. Jack barely noticed. His mind was far from the sterile, fluorescent-lit prison. He was back in the desert, in the oppressive heat of Iraq, where the sun baked the sand until it was so hot it felt like walking on fire. He could still smell the burning oil fields, thick black smoke curling into the sky, choking the air. He could still hear the distant echoes of mortar shells, the crackling static of radio chatter, the last gasping breaths of fallen brothers in arms. But the war had ended decades ago. And for Jack, another war had begun, the one against his own body. "Mr. Sullivan," a voice called, cutting through the haze of his thoughts. Jack blinked, his tired eyes focusing on Dr. Patel, his oncologist. A kind man with gentle features and dark circles beneath his eyes, Dr. Patel had been treating Jack for months now. Today, he held a clipboard close to his chest, his fingers tightening around its edges. Jack had been a soldier long enough to recognize bad news before it was spoken. "Just tell me, Doc," Jack muttered, his voice rough from years of smoking, from inhaling things no man should inhale. Dr. Patel sighed, his expression weary. "The chemotherapy. It's not working as we hoped." Jack exhaled sharply, his fingers curling into fists. He had expected it, but hearing it still felt like a bullet to the gut. "There is another treatment option," Dr. Patel continued cautiously. "CAR-T cell therapy. It's an advanced form of immunotherapy, highly effective for cases like yours." Jack's chest tightened, but a flicker of hope lit up in his tired eyes. "All right. Sign me up." Dr. Patel hesitated, and that hesitation was worse than anything he could have said. "The treatment is expensive," the doctor admitted, "and it's not covered by VA healthcare." Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else in the room. "What do you mean not covered?" Jack's voice rose. "I served this country for 22 damn years. 2 wars. I inhaled all kinds of poison they burned in those damn pits, and now they're telling me they won't help me." Dr. Patel lowered his head. He had seen this reaction before. Too many times. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said softly. "I truly am." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry, his entire body trembling, not from sickness, but from betrayal. He had risked his life, bled for his country, watched his brothers die. And now, when he needed help the most, they were turning their backs on him. He sat in silence for a long time after Dr. Patel left. The other patients in the ward stole cautious glances at him, sensing the storm brewing behind his hollow eyes. Then, without a word, he ripped the IV out of his arm. Blood dribbled down his forearm, staining the sleeve of his hospital gown. A nurse gasped, rushing toward him. But Jack shot her a look that stopped her in her tracks. "I'm done," he growled, pushing himself up from the chair. His legs wobbled, weak from months of treatment, but he steadied himself against the armrest. "Mr. Sullivan, you can't just leave." The nurse protested, panic in her voice. "You need care." Jack gave a bitter laugh. "Care? This isn't care. This is watching a man die slowly because he can't afford to live." He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, shrugging it on over his thin hospital gown. He had no home, no family waiting for him, nowhere to go. But he sure as hell wasn't going to sit here and let cancer win on its own terms. As he stepped into the hallway, security guards were already approaching, alerted by the commotion. Jack glared at them. "Don't bother," he muttered. brushing past them. "I'm leaving." The automatic doors whooshed open, and the cold evening air hit him like a slap. The world outside was wet and gray, mist clinging to the pavement. He had nowhere to go, no one waiting for him. But he had made his choice. Jack Sullivan walked out into the night, into the rain, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of a lifetime pressing down on his weary shoulders. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he was done fighting a war he couldn't win. Rock bottom. Jack Sullivan wheeled himself through the rain-soaked streets, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. The cold mist clung to his skin, mixing with the feverish sweat trickling down his forehead. His body trembled from the exhaustion of his illness, but he pushed forward, gripping the wheels of his chair with a stubborn determination that had defined him his whole life. He had nothing left. No money, no home, no treatment. The reality of it settled over him like the weight of his old military rucksack. He wasn't just another veteran struggling to get by. He was dying, and nobody cared. The city around him moved on, indifferent to his presence. People passed by on the sidewalk, their eyes flickering toward him before quickly darting away, as if the mere sight of him was an inconvenience. It was a reaction he had grown used to. Jack reached the edge of a narrow alleyway and turned into it, seeking shelter from the wind and rain. His hands burned from gripping the wet, ice-cold metal of his wheelchair. He pulled the thin blanket tighter around himself, his body shivering violently. The alley smelled of damp cardboard and stale urine, a reminder of where people like him ended up when the world had no use for them anymore. A few other homeless figures sat huddled in the shadows, barely acknowledging his arrival. This was not a place for conversation. It was a place for those who had fallen so far that words no longer mattered. Jack parked his wheelchair near the side of a dumpster, his hands clenching and unclenching as he tried to ignore the gnawing pain in his chest. He coughed hard, his lungs rattling with every breath. He spit to the side, dark crimson droplets hitting the pavement. He closed his eyes and leaned back, the cold seeping into his bones. He wasn't sure how long he sat there. Minutes, hours, time had lost all meaning. Then, through the haze of his exhaustion, he heard something. Footsteps. Light. Cautious. Not the hurried steps of someone passing by, but the deliberate approach of someone with intent. Jack forced his heavy eyes open. A young woman stood a few feet away from him, her hoodie pulled up over her head, shielding her from the rain. Her face was partially hidden in the dim alley light, but he could make out the concern in her eyes. "Hey," she said softly, shifting nervously on her feet. Jack grunted in response, not in the mood for conversation. "You okay?" she asked, taking a small step closer. Jack let out a bitter chuckle. "Do I look okay?" The woman hesitated, then crouched down in front of him, her eyes studying him intently. "You're sick," she observed. "And you just came from the hospital." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What's it to you?" She bit her lip, as if debating whether to tell him the truth. Then she sighed. "I've seen you before." At the shelter. Jack stiffened. He had been avoiding that place lately, unwilling to return to its crowded, suffocating walls. The other residents reminded him too much of himself, tired, broken, abandoned. "I volunteer there sometimes," the woman continued. "Your name's Jack, right?" He eyed her warily. "Who's asking?" She hesitated, then pulled her hood back slightly. "Sophia." Jack frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "You don't remember me," she said, more a statement than a question. Jack shook his head, squinting at her. There was something about her eyes. Deep brown, wide with kindness. "You gave me your coat once," Sophia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was the middle of winter, and I was freezing outside the shelter. You didn't even think twice. Just handed it to me." Jack blinked. It was coming back to him now. She had been just a kid back then, maybe 16 or 17. Her thin frame wrapped in a torn sweater that barely protected her from the cold. He had been in better shape at the time, still strong enough to move without the wheelchair. He had draped his old army-issued coat around her shoulders and told her to get inside before she froze to death. He had never thought about it again. That had been years ago. Now here she was, standing in front of him, looking at him with that same mix of gratitude and worry. Jack scoffed. That was a long time ago. Sophia nodded. Yeah, but I never forgot. Jack let out a slow, tired breath, turning his gaze away. He didn't need pity. I'm fine, he muttered. Sophia studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. No, you're not. Jack clenched his jaw. I don't need saving. Sophia sighed. Maybe not, but you look like you could use a damn meal. Jack started to protest, but before he could, she stood up and walked away, disappearing around the corner. He stared after her, confused. And then, minutes later, she returned. She crouched back down in front of him, holding out a steaming styrofoam container. I got this from the shelter, she said. They won't mind if I give it to you. Jack hesitated, pride warring with hunger. But the smell of warm food was too tempting. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the container. He opened it. Beef stew. Real food. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. He picked up the plastic spoon and took a slow bite. It was the first real meal he'd had in days. Sophia sat down on the damp pavement beside him, pulling her hoodie back up. Neither of them spoke. Jack ate in silence, his hand shaking as he shoveled the stew into his mouth. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. When he was done, he set the empty container aside, leaning back against the dumpster with a heavy sigh. His stomach was full, but his heart still felt just as empty. You don't have to sit here, he muttered. Sophia shrugged. I don't have anywhere else to be. Jack glanced at her, noting the shadows under her eyes. You still living at the shelter? He asked. She hesitated. Sometimes. Jack frowned. You shouldn't be out here alone. Sophia smirked. Neither should you. Jack let out a dry chuckle. Fair enough. The rain continued to fall, the city humming in the background. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't feel entirely alone. And for now, that was enough. The tap on his shoulder. The wind howled through the narrow alley, whipping the rain sideways as the city of Seattle pulsed in the distance. Jack sat slouched in his wheelchair, his body numb from the cold, his thoughts wandering through dark corridors he'd long stopped trying to escape. Sophia sat beside him, legs drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped around herself to stay warm. They were two ghosts in a city that had long since stopped noticing them. Jack exhaled slowly, watching his breath disappear into the night. The stew she had brought him sat warm in his belly, a rare comfort in the bleakness of his existence. But he knew it was temporary. Everything in his life was temporary. His shelter, his food, his time. What's your story, kid? He asked, his voice rough. Sophia turned her head slightly, her hoodie shadowing her face. What do you mean? Jack shrugged. I mean, why are you here? You're young. You should be out there, living your life. Sophia let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. Yeah. And what kind of life would that be? Jack studied her, noting the sharp angles of her face, the way her eyes darted to the mouth of the alley every time someone passed by. A habit, the survival instinct. He had the same one. She sighed. I ran away from home when I was 16. My mom she had problems. Bad ones. The kind that made her forget she had a daughter. Jack remained silent. He'd heard this story before, different versions, same ending. So I bounced around, she continued. Stayed with friends for a while, but you can only be someone's burden for so long before they start making excuses. Eventually, I ended up on the streets. She shrugged, like it was just another fact of life. Been here ever since. Jack nodded, staring at the wet pavement beneath them. Yeah, he murmured. I know how that goes. Sophia studied him for a moment. You never told me your story. Jack smirked, though there was no humor in it. "You already know most of it." She shook her head. "No, I don't. I know you're a vet. I know you got sick. But I don't know why you're here." Jack exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because I got tired of fighting." Sophia tilted her head. "Fighting who?" Jack gave her a pointed look. "The system. The government. Myself. It doesn't matter. You fight and fight. And in the end, you're still here, freezing in a damn alley, waiting for the inevitable." Sophia was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is that why you were on the bridge?" Jack stiffened. He hadn't told her about that. His heart pounded in his chest, the memory of that moment still fresh in his mind, the wind whipping around him, the water churning below, the weight of every failure pressing down on him. He had been ready. But then, Jack closed his eyes, his pulse throbbing in his ears. The tap on his shoulder. He had been right there, perched on the edge, when he had felt it. A light touch, barely noticeable, but strong enough to jolt him back to reality. He had turned, expecting to see a stranger, maybe a cop, maybe some do-gooder trying to talk him down. But it wasn't a stranger. It was a ghost. Or at least, that's what it had felt like. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Yeah," he admitted finally. "That's why." Sophia didn't press him for more. She just nodded, as if she understood. Maybe she did. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the city settling into a restless silence. Jack shifted, his body aching from the cold, his lungs burning with each breath. He wasn't going to last much longer like this. And honestly, maybe that was the point. "I should get going," Sophia murmured, pushing herself to her feet. She pulled her hoodie tighter around herself, shivering. "Shelter's got a curfew. If I don't check in, I'll lose my bed." Jack nodded, though he didn't look at her. "Yeah, you should go." Sophia hesitated. "What about you?" Jack smirked. "Don't worry about me, kid. I've been doing this longer than you." Sophia frowned, clearly debating whether to argue. Then, with a sigh, she pulled something from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. A folded $20 bill. Jack stared at it. "Where'd you get this?" She shrugged. "Does it matter?" Jack looked up at her, trying to gauge if she had stolen it, if she had sold something, herself, for it. Sophia just smiled, but there was something sad about it. "Just get yourself something warm, okay?" Jack clenched his jaw. He wanted to refuse. He didn't take handouts. But then again, neither did she. He nodded, slipping the bill into his coat pocket. "Thanks, kid." She nodded back, then turned and disappeared down the alley. Jack sat there for a long time, staring at the place where she had been. For the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him and seen him. But it didn't change anything. Jack closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the cold brick wall. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, he would go back to the bridge. And this time, nothing would stop him. A hand reaching back. The cold morning air clawed at Jack Sullivan's skin as he pushed his wheelchair through the damp streets of Seattle. His breath came in short, wheezing bursts, his body trembling from exhaustion. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. His stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with something worse, something he didn't have the strength to name. It had been a long time since Jack Sullivan had made a plan. But today, he had one. And it ended at the bridge. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't debating whether or not to go through with it. The decision had been made the moment the doctors told him there was nothing more they could do. At least, nothing the government would pay for. His whole life had been about sacrifice. Sacrificing his body, his sanity, his future for a country that had thrown him away the second he was no longer useful. He had accepted it, the way a soldier accepts his orders. But this was a different kind of war, and he had lost. The streets were empty this early in the morning. The city still waking from its restless sleep. Storefronts stood dark and shuttered, their neon signs flickering in the misty dawn. Somewhere, a bus rumbled past, kicking up puddles, but no one was looking at him. No one ever looked at him. Jack wheeled himself toward the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, his fingers numb from gripping the frozen metal rims of his chair. The bridge loomed ahead, its steel beams stretching into the fog like the bones of some long-dead giant. It was quiet. Perfect. Jack stopped near the pedestrian walkway, just past the halfway mark. The wind was stronger here, whipping through his tattered jacket, howling in his ears like the ghosts of his past. He glanced down at the water below, dark and endless, swirling in restless currents. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. Mariah, his wife, the only person who had ever truly understood him. He traced her face with his fingers, his chest tightening. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. Then, with trembling hands, he placed the photograph on his lap and gripped the railing. He took one deep breath, bracing himself. But just as he started to push himself forward, a hand gripped his shoulder. Firm, steady, real. Jack froze. For a moment, he thought it was Mariah. That somehow, she had reached through the veil of death to stop him. But when he turned, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't Mariah. It was his daughter, Susie. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His mind went blank, his body locked in place. She was older now. Her hair was longer, pulled into a messy ponytail. Her face, so much like her mother's, was streaked with tears, her dark eyes wide with fear and something else. Relief. "Dad," she choked out, tightening her grip on his shoulder. "I found you." Jack couldn't move, couldn't speak. His brain refused to process what was happening. She shouldn't be here. She couldn't be here. He hadn't seen her in over 15 years. The last time he had laid eyes on her, she had been a teenager, angry, hurt, looking at him like he was a ghost even though he was still breathing. And now here she was, real, solid, and pulling him back from the edge. Jack swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Susie." She let out a sob and nodded, gripping the front of his jacket like she was afraid he would disappear. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice breaking. "For so long." Jack blinked, his hands shaking. How did you?" "Maria at the shelter," she answered, swallowing her tears. "She called me, told me you left. I drove all over the city. I thought I was too late." Her breath hitched. "Jesus, Dad, what are you doing?" Jack opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the years he had missed. The birthdays, the graduations, the late-night talks he never had, the hugs he never gave. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. Guilt. Raw. Overwhelming. "I thought you hated me," he whispered. Susie let out a shaky laugh, half a sob. "God, Dad, I never hated you. I was angry, yeah, but I never hated you." Jack shook his head, his throat tightening. "I wasn't a good father." Susie knelt beside him, gripping both of his hands in hers. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but you're still my dad. And I'm not letting you do this." Jack's vision blurred. The weight of his decision, the years of pain, the unbearable loneliness, all of it came crashing down at once. He clenched his jaw, his body trembling. "I don't have anything left, Susie." "Yes, you do." She squeezed his hands. "You have me." Jack let out a broken breath. He felt the wind against his face, the cold seeping into his bones. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something else. Warmth, hope, a hand reaching back. And for the first time in years, he reached back too. Jack Sullivan had been ready to let go. He had convinced himself there was nothing left, nothing worth staying for. The years of sickness, of abandonment, of pain, He had carried them alone for so long that he believed there was no one left to share the weight. And yet here she was, his daughter, Susie, holding on to him with a grip that was unshakable. Jack felt his body tremble, not just from the cold wind whipping across the bridge, but from the sheer force of emotions flooding through him all at once. His heart, which had felt lifeless for years, now pounded in his chest like it was trying to remind him it was still there, that it still mattered. His daughter had found him, against all odds after all these years. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat and squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could blink away the past. But it was still there, pressing against his ribs like an iron weight. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice raw. Susie let out a short, shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "What, so you could just disappear and no one would know?" "No, Dad. I wasn't going to let that happen." Jack turned his head away, ashamed. It would have been easier. Susie's grip on his jacket tightened. "Easier for who?" "Because it sure as hell wouldn't have been easier for me." Jack opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened painfully. She was right. He had spent so long convincing himself that no one cared, that he had been completely forgotten. But he had been wrong. She had been looking for him. She had never stopped looking for him. Jack felt something crack inside him, something heavy that had been buried for years, and suddenly, he couldn't hold it in anymore. His shoulders began to shake, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something that had been festering in him for too long. Regret, guilt, loss. "I didn't know," he whispered, barely able to speak past the tightness in his throat. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the wind and the distant rush of traffic. I thought I lost you." Susie's face crumpled, and she reached up, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "I was never lost," she murmured. "You were." Jack's breath hitched. For the first time in years, he let himself cry. It wasn't the silent kind of crying, the kind that slipped past in a moment of weakness and disappeared just as quickly. No, this was something deeper, something raw. The tears spilled freely, tracing paths down his weathered cheeks, mixing with the rain. His body shuddered as decades of pain and loneliness erupted all at once. Susie held on to him through it all. She didn't pull away. She didn't let go. She just held him, like she had been waiting to do for years. Jack had never allowed himself to be held like this before, not since Mariah. He had always been the one to carry everything, to be the unshakable soldier, the strong one. But now he was just a man, a broken man. And somehow his daughter had still found something worth saving in him. The wind howled around them, the mist thickening as the first hints of dawn crept into the sky. For a long time, they stayed like that, father and daughter, holding onto each other on the edge of the bridge, in the middle of a city that had long forgotten them. Finally, after what felt like forever, Jack took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled back slightly. He wiped at his face, still shaken, still overwhelmed. "You came all this way," he rasped, his voice thick. "Why?" Susie let out a watery laugh. "Because you're my dad, you idiot." Jack exhaled a sharp breath, somewhere between a chuckle and a sob. He shook his head, still struggling to process all of this. "I don't deserve this," he muttered, staring down at his hands. Susie reached out and took them in hers, gripping them tightly. "You don't get to decide that," she said softly. "I do." Jack swallowed hard. He had spent so long believing that he had lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, he had something left after all. Susie let out a small, nervous breath and glanced over at his wheelchair. "Come on, let's get out of here." Jack hesitated. He had wanted to die today. That had been the plan. That had been the whole reason he came here. But now, with his daughter standing in front of him, with her hands still holding onto him like he was something worth saving, he didn't want to go over that edge anymore. Jack nodded slowly. "All right," he murmured. Susie let out a shaky breath of relief and helped him back into his wheelchair. She kept her hands on his shoulders, as if afraid he would slip away if she let go. Jack felt the weight in his chest shift. It wasn't gone. Not yet. But it was lighter than before. As they turned away from the edge and wheeled back toward solid ground, the first rays of the morning sun cut through the mist, spilling golden light across the bridge. Jack looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Maybe there was still something worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. A second chance. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and salt from the nearby bay. The mist that had clung to the city throughout the night was beginning to lift, revealing a skyline that seemed almost foreign to Jack Sullivan. For years, he had moved through these streets as a ghost, unseen, unnoticed. He had walked through the shadows of skyscrapers, past people who looked through him rather than at him. But today was different. Today, someone had reached for him, and Jack, for the first time in a long time, had reached back, leaving the bridge behind. Susie pushed Jack's wheelchair down the pedestrian walkway, her hands gripping the handles tightly as if afraid he might roll away if she let go. She hadn't spoken much since pulling him away from the ledge, but she didn't need to. Jack could feel her relief, the way she exhaled slowly every few moments, as if convincing herself that this was real, that she had found him in time. He still wasn't sure what to say. Part of him still struggled to believe she was really here, that she had been looking for him, that despite all the years of silence and mistakes, she had never given up. Jack shifted in his chair, his joints aching from the cold. "How long have you been looking for me?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Susie didn't answer immediately. She guided him toward the exit of the bridge, moving past early morning joggers and commuters who barely spared them a glance. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "Years," she admitted. Jack's fingers tightened on the arms of his chair. "Why?" Susie stopped walking. The city buzzed around them, car horns blaring in the distance, the hum of conversations from coffee shops bleeding into the streets. But in that moment, it felt like everything had gone silent. Jack turned his head, looking up at her. Susie swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Because you're my dad," she said simply. "Because I didn't want to believe that you were just gone." Jack felt his chest tighten. "I didn't want to leave," he muttered. "Not at first." Susie exhaled, shaking her head. "But you did." Jack looked away. "Yeah," he admitted. "I did." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years lost, of things left unsaid. Jack closed his eyes, the guilt pressing down on him. "You deserve better." Susie let out a short, breathy laugh, one without humor. "Yeah," she said. "I did." Jack flinched. He had expected her to argue, to tell him it wasn't his fault, that things had been complicated. But Susie had always been direct, always spoken the truth. And the truth was, she had deserved better. Jack had left her and Micah behind, drowning in his own demons, convincing himself that they were better off without him. But looking at Susie now, the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands still trembled slightly, he realized just how wrong he had been. They had never been better off without him. They had been surviving without him. And there was a difference. Jack exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. Susie studied him for a moment, then crouched down so they were eye level. "You start over," she said. Jack let out a bitter chuckle. "A little late for that, don't you think?" Susie shook her head. "No, it's not." Jack frowned. "Susie." "I don't need you to be perfect, Dad," she interrupted. "I don't need you to make up for everything right this second. But I do need you to try." Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't even know how to start over," he admitted. Susie's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, slowly, She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Jack blinked. "What's that?" She exhaled. "My house keys." Jack's stomach twisted. "Susie." "Don't argue," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you to move in forever, but you are coming with me." Jack hesitated. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Jack clenched his jaw, looking away. "I don't want to be a burden." Susie let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You're not a burden, Dad." Jack scoffed. "That's not how the world sees it." Susie's expression hardened. "I don't give a damn how the world sees it." Jack looked at her then, really looked at her. She was serious. And for the first time in years, someone was fighting for him. Jack swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Okay," he murmured. Susie blinked, as if surprised he had agreed so quickly. Jack let out a shaky breath and gave her a small, tired smile. "Okay," he repeated. The road home. Jack had forgotten what it felt like to sit in a car that wasn't a city bus or a shelter van. The warmth of the heater hummed against his legs as he stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The streets of Seattle were still wet from the early morning rain, the pavement reflecting the neon glow of coffee shops and storefronts. Susie's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles tight, like she was afraid if she loosened her grip, Jack might disappear. Jack exhaled, leaning back against the seat. "I'm sorry about Micah," he murmured. Susie's hand stiffened. Jack winced. "I should have been there," he continued, "for both of you." Susie didn't speak right away. Then softly, she said, "Yeah, you should have." Jack closed his eyes. "But," she added, her voice steadier, "you're here now." Jack turned his head, looking at her. She met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the road. "That's got to count for something, right?" Jack exhaled slowly. Maybe. Maybe it did. A new beginning. Susie's house was small, but warm. The kind of place Jack had forgotten existed. A real home, not just a shelter or a hospital room. She helped him inside, guiding his wheelchair over the threshold. Jack felt out of place, like an intruder in a life he didn't belong to anymore. But then, Susie patted his shoulder and gave him a small, hesitant smile. "Welcome home, Dad." Jack swallowed hard. For the first time in years, the word home didn't feel like a distant memory. It felt like a possibility. Redemption. Jack Sullivan sat in the warmth of his daughter's home, his fingers curled around a cup of steaming black coffee. The bitter aroma filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon candles burning somewhere in the house. It had been years since he had sat in a place like this, where the air was thick with the quiet hum of a lived-in home, where the walls weren't bare and sterile, where warmth came not just from the heater, but from something deeper. Something he had forgotten. Something called family. A place he never expected to be. Susie moved around the small kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, her movements precise but slightly nervous. Jack noticed the way her fingers tapped against the ceramic mug, the way her shoulders tensed like she was waiting for him to run. She didn't trust this moment. Didn't trust that he would stay. Hell, he wasn't sure he trusted it either. Jack swallowed hard and looked around. The house was modest, but full. Pictures lined the walls, shelves stacked with books. A soft couch that looked well used sat in the center of the living room, covered in blankets. There were signs of a life he had missed. On the fireplace mantel, there were framed photos. Jack's throat tightened as he wheeled closer. There was one of Susie when she was younger, barely 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, and smiling at the camera with uncontained joy. Another of her as a teenager, holding up a volleyball trophy, a determined fire in her eyes. Then one of Micah. Jack sucked in a sharp breath. Micah. His son, frozen in time. Jack reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the frame. Micah was in his graduation cap, his grin wide. His eyes, Maria's eyes, shining with a pride Jack had never been there to witness. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, grief squeezing his chest like a fist. "I should have been there," he whispered. Susie, standing just a few feet behind him, exhaled softly. "Yeah." Jack turned his wheelchair slightly to face her, his heart heavy. "What was he like after I left?" Susie hesitated, staring into her coffee for a long moment before speaking. "He was angry," she admitted. "At first anyway. He thought maybe you'd come back. That maybe one day you'd walk through the door and tell us it had all been a mistake." Jack clenched his jaw, shame washing over him. "But when Mom died," Susie continued, her voice tight, "he stopped waiting. He just focused on moving forward. College, work. He didn't talk about you much, but I know he thought about you." Jack swallowed the guilt rising in his throat. And then Susie's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "And then the accident happened." Jack sucked in a sharp breath. "I got the call in the middle of the night," she murmured, her eyes distant. "A drunk driver ran a red light, hit him head-on. He didn't even make it to the hospital." Jack closed his eyes, his fingers curling into fists. The pain was sharp, fresh, like a blade twisting in his ribs. "I never even got to say goodbye," he choked out. Susie let out a soft breath, and for the first time, her voice softened. "Neither did I." Jack nodded slowly, staring down at his lap, his fingers gripping the edges of his chair. "I don't deserve to be here," he murmured. Susie set her coffee down on the table, stepping closer. "That's not your choice to make, Dad." Jack looked up, his eyes burning. "You sure about that?" Susie's lips pressed into a thin line, and then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Jack frowned. "What's that?" She hesitated before holding it out to him. "Micah wrote this," she said, "before he died." Jack's stomach twisted. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the paper. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Susie exhaled sharply. "Because I didn't know if you deserved it." Jack flinched, but he couldn't argue. "But now," Susie continued, "now, I think you need to read it." Jack stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally taking it. His hand shook as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning Micah's handwriting. The same handwriting Jack had seen on homework assignments years ago, back when his son had still been a boy, back before he had disappeared from their lives. "Dear Dad, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you're still alive. But if you are, I want you to know something. I spent a long time being angry at you. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, why you left, why you didn't come back. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself you didn't matter. But the truth is, I still love you. I don't know if I'll ever see you again. I don't know if you even think about us anymore. But if you do, if you're out there somewhere, I just want you to know that despite everything, I don't hate you. I miss you. I hope you're okay. And if you ever come back, I hope you'll find your way home. Micah." Jack's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the letter, his chest aching in a way he hadn't let himself feel in years. His son had never hated him. Even after all the years, all the silence, Micah had still hoped for him. Jack let out a shuddering breath, his vision blurring. "He never stopped loving you," Susie murmured. Jack's throat was too tight to speak. He had been running for so long. Running from his past. Running from his family. Running from himself. But now he had a choice. He could keep running, or he could try. Jack exhaled shakily and wiped at his face, nodding slowly. Susie watched him carefully. "What do you want to do, Dad?" Jack took a deep breath. And then, for the first time in decades, he said the words he had been too afraid to believe in. "I want to come home." Susie smiled, a small, real smile. "Then let's start there. A future worth fighting for." The days that followed weren't perfect. Jack still struggled. His body was weak. His mind still fought against the demons that had plagued him for years. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. Susie helped him schedule his treatments, the ones the VA wouldn't cover, but she would. She set up a bedroom for him in her house, a real bed, not a shelter cot or a hospital recliner. And little by little, Jack started to heal. Not just his body, but his heart. The road ahead was long. He knew that. But for the first time in years, Jack Sullivan wasn't walking it alone. And maybe, just maybe, he would finally find his way home. Redemption and homecoming. Jack Sullivan sat in the living room of Susie's house, staring at the letter from Micah for what felt like the 100th time. His calloused fingers traced the edges of the paper, as if memorizing the weight of it in its hands. He had read it over and over, absorbing every word, every emotion his son had put into it. It was both a gift and a curse. A gift because for the first time in years, he felt connected to Micah in a way he thought had been lost forever. A curse because the weight of his absence crushed him, pressing down on his chest with every breath he took. Susie sat across from him, sipping coffee, watching him carefully. She wasn't pushing him to talk. She wasn't demanding answers. She was just there. And somehow, that meant more than anything she could have said. Jack exhaled and set the letter down on the table between them. "I don't deserve this," he muttered. Susie sighed, setting her cup down. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But it's not about what you deserve. It's about what happens next." Jack met her gaze, his throat tight. "And what if I don't know what happens next?" Susie leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Then you figure it out, one step at a time." Jack swallowed hard, nodding. He had spent so long running from his past, from the people he had let down, from the memories that haunted him. But now, for the first time, he had stopped. And the road ahead, while terrifying, didn't feel as impossible as it had before. First steps toward healing. The first few weeks in Susie's home were strange. Jack had spent years living on the streets, sleeping under overpasses, in shelters, in hospital waiting rooms. The idea of a soft bed, of waking up to the smell of coffee and hearing another person in the house, was foreign. At first, he resisted it. He barely slept, his body too conditioned to the discomfort of concrete and cold nights. His mind fought against the silence, always waiting for some unseen danger to wake him. But Susie was patient. She didn't push, didn't force him to talk or act as if everything was fine. She just let him exist. And slowly, so slowly, Jack started to settle in. He took small steps. He let Susie help him schedule a real doctor's appointment. He let her drive him to the VA office to start the long battle for better benefits. He let himself sit in the backyard on warm afternoons, feeling the sunlight on his skin, remembering what it was like to just be. One day, as he sat outside watching the leaves dance in the wind, Susie came out and handed him a small notebook. Jack frowned. "What's this?" Susie sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "You always said you didn't know what happens next," she said. "So, write it down. Make a plan, even if it's just one step at a time." Jack stared at the blank pages. For years, he had stopped planning for the future, because he didn't believe he had one. But now, as he ran his fingers over the cover, something shifted in his chest. Maybe it was time to start again. Visiting the past. 2 months later, Susie pulled up to a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Jack sat stiffly in the passenger seat, gripping the folded letter in his lap. His fingers trembled, his stomach twisting in knots. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. Susie reached over, squeezing his hand. "You can," she said softly. "And you don't have to do it alone." Jack swallowed hard and nodded. Susie got out of the car and retrieved his wheelchair from the trunk. Jack had regained some strength, but he still needed it for longer trips. As she helped him settle in, neither of them spoke. The cemetery was quiet, the morning air crisp. The grass was damp beneath the wheels as Susie guided him down a winding path. Then they reached it. Micah Sullivan. Jack's breath hitched as he read the name on the headstone. The dates, The simple inscription, "Beloved son, brother, and friend." Jack's chest ached. Susie knelt beside him, brushing fallen leaves from the grave. She placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the headstone, her fingers lingering on the stone. Jack's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter he had written. His own words felt insufficient, but he had needed to say them. He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, kid," he began. "It's me, your old man." He exhaled shakily, blinking back the sting of tears. "I should have been there," he whispered. "I should have been there for you and Susie. For your mom. I let my demons win, and I ran. But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you." His voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep going. "I spent years believing I didn't deserve to come back, that it was too late. But your sister, she proved me wrong." Jack swallowed hard. "I read your letter, son," he said softly. "And I want you to know, I'm trying. I'm not running anymore." A breeze whispered through the cemetery, rustling the leaves. Jack closed his eyes, imagining, for just a moment, that Micah was there. Watching. Listening. He reached out and placed the letter on the headstone, his fingers brushing the cool stone. "I love you, kid," he murmured. "And I'm so damn proud of you." The words felt small compared to the years lost, but they were real. And that was what mattered. Beside him, Susie sniffled, wiping her eyes. Jack reached out and squeezed her hand. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. The past couldn't be changed. But the future, that was still unwritten. The road ahead. Jack Sullivan wasn't healed overnight. His body was still weak. His past still haunted him. But he was fighting now. For his health. For his daughter. For himself. The old soldier who had once been ready to give up now sat in the backyard of his daughter's home, writing in the notebook she had given him. Not about the past. Not about regrets. But about what came next. Because for the first time in decades, Jack Sullivan believed in something. A second chance. A life worth living. And a family that never stopped believing in him. The road ahead was long. But this time, he wasn't walking it alone.